I grew up in the 1990s, which means that I grew up in the age of movie and video game rental stores, Blockbuster, and the like. Now, I don't typically think of myself as much of a nostalgist, but I admittedly missed this more technologically primitive era. Smartphones didn't yet exist, the World Wide Web was a relatively new invention, and my decisions about which video game I should play next weren't based on the influence of media outlets, YouTubers, streamers, podcasters, and so on. My decisions were almost solely influenced by a game's box art, and that alone. On a trip back from the grocery store with my mom, she'd often stop at the local video store and let me rent a game for a few nights. It was a simple gesture, but a real treat and a memory I hold dear. I can vividly remember walking up and down the aisles, examining box art and reading summary blurbs for dozens and dozens of games. These images and a few lines of copy were the only bits of information I had, so I usually just picked the games with, in my opinion, the coolest art and the most intriguing copy. This led to both life-changing and regrettable decisions. The experience was a total grab bag, but that was half the fun of it. And it meant I was getting my hands on all different kinds of games. Racing games, platforming games, first-person shooter games. I didn't even have much of a concept of genres at this point in my life. I was just a kid playing anything that sparked my interest. Sometimes I think we can learn a lot from that often lost sense of childhood wonder. I'll never forget the day. It was winter, late 1997 or early 1998, when I saw the box art of Doom 64 for the first time. It called to me in a familiar kind of way. I was a Nintendo Power subscriber in those days, so maybe I had seen it featured in the pages of the magazine. And sure, I was young, but even I knew that big M ESRB label meant that this game was not supposed to be for me. But in a way, that made it even more intriguing, like a piece of forbidden fruit. I remember picking it up and carrying it over to my mom, even handing it to her with my finger strategically over the rating label. But she didn't even need to see that. Based on the satanic-looking cover art alone depicting the mother demon, she said no way, pick out something else. So I sulked back to the shelf and did just that. I think I got Diddy Kong Racing instead, which wasn't a terrible trade-off, honestly. But I never forgot about Doom 64. In the following weeks and months, I'd go back to its spot on the shelf and re-examine that box art. I still remember the back of the box featured a screaming demon, the kind that resembles modern Doom's pinkies, with the words "kill" or "be killed" in all caps. Again, there was no YouTube, there was no Twitch. All I could do was use my mind's eye to imagine what this scary but enticing game must have been like. At the time, GoldenEye 007 was extremely popular among my friends and I, and Doom 64 looked kind of like GoldenEye, but then again, it looked nothing like GoldenEye. The enemies, the weapons, the color palette, bright reds and greens. But alas, I wouldn't actually have an opportunity to play this mysterious game until a few years later, maybe 2000 or 2001, when I played it at a friend's or cousin's house, like many of us did. I had a few useful people in my life whose parents were, for better or worse, less strict about their children's taste in video games. And I can still remember running around level 1, the staging area, and thinking, what is this? At the time, I was comparing Doom 64's gameplay and level design to that of GoldenEye's spiritual successor, Perfect Dark, which I was obsessed with. And Doom 64 was decidedly different in just about every way. And it was around this time that I decided I, once and for all, had to find out what this game and its franchise were all about. So, as one did, I conducted a little dial-up internet research, and what I found was beyond interesting. Stories about Texas-based id Software and this group of long-haired guys led by John Carmack and John Romero, who had been developing these violent, fast-paced, heavy metal-inspired shooters since the early 90s, games that had spawned a wave of first-person shooters known as Doom clones, and even ultimately influenced my favorite FPS games at the time, like GoldenEye and Perfect Dark, among many others. It wasn't until years later that I could fully appreciate Doom's significance in the history of video gaming. In my book, the original Doom goes right up there alongside Pong, Tetris, Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Grand Theft Auto 3, Demon's Souls, etc., as one of the most important video games ever created. You simply cannot talk about the history of video games without talking about Doom. In the mid-1990s, id Software had struck a partnership with Midway Games, then known as Williams Entertainment, the now-defunct publisher-developer of notable games like Mortal Kombat, Rampage, NBA Jam, Cruisin' USA, and others. Midway handled the PlayStation 1 port of Doom and Doom 2, which released as a single title in 1995. Opinions on the many ports of Doom games are naturally all over the board, but I always thought this was an interesting one. Midway modified Doom's rendering engine for PS1, which allowed for greater color depth, animated skies, and other unique and enhanced features. And allegedly, because Midway didn't want to pay royalties to legendary Doom composer Bobby Prince, who worked as an independent contractor, they hired composer Aubrey Hodges to compose new original music for the port, which was much more ambient and eerie than most of Prince's work. So with the upcoming launch of the Nintendo 64, id Software, pleased with Midway's latest work, granted the studio creative license to develop a wholly new Doom game for the 64-bit console. And Midway did just that. With gentle supervising and guidance from id, Midway developed their very own take on the franchise, Doom 64. The game I found myself clutching in awe on that cold, blustery day in the video rental store. For this Nintendo exclusive, Midway brought back Hodges for the soundtrack, which largely contributes to the game's unique atmosphere. And Midway also utilized a completely new game engine for the project, and it shows. Doom 64 feels like classic Doom and was designed by a team that was familiar with the inner workings of Doom 1 and 2's infrastructure, but Doom 64 has a very unique flavor of its own. The new engine meant that Doom 64 would feature redesigned demon sprites, all of which were modeled by Gregor Punchatz, the demon concept artist for id's original Doom games. Fun fact, Gregor's father, Don Ivan Punchatz, was actually the artist who created the original Doom's package art and logo. But Gregor created new models of almost every demon type, with only a few exceptions like the Archvile and Revenant, which were cut from Doom 64 only due to the storage limitations of the cartridge-based Nintendo console. When Doom 64 released in March 1997, it received positive and lukewarm reviews. Some called it the greatest Doom game yet, while others were less impressed by what they viewed as more of the same. By the way, not that I agree with those reviews, but when is more of a good thing ever bad? I never understood that. Some people will tell you Doom 64 is the weakest of the classic Doom games, while others will tell you it's an underrated masterpiece. I'm definitely in the latter camp. As much as I love the first two Doom games, Doom 64 is genuinely my favorite classic Doom game. And now, 20 plus years after I was the kid clutching that N64 box on the video rental store, I feel like I have enough time and perspective with this game and its franchise to tell you why it's my favorite classic Doom game. Doom 64 gets your attention right away. Instead of Prince's guitar riff-focused Pantera and Alice in Chains-inspired soundtracks, Hodges' minimalist noise tracks, honestly the stuff of nightmares, set the mood perfectly. In my opinion, the technological limitations of the day actually add to the amazing aesthetic. It reminds me a lot of the music of experimental English group Coil. I always wondered if Hodges was inspired by them. The tracks have such a unique quality to them, a somewhat grating, humming, industrial ambience, occasionally peppered with howls and cries. It has to be one of the most wild and experimental video game soundtracks ever created, and for that reason is probably underrated. And we have to talk about Doom 64's 30 plus levels, their excellent design. But first, their names. Doom 64 easily features my favorite level names of any Doom game. They're so heavy metal. They truly read like the track listing of a black metal album. The Bleeding, Spawned Fear, Altar of Pain. Gosh, they're so sick. But the levels in Doom 64 are both dark, yet highly colorized. There's claustrophobic corridors and wide open arenas. Certain areas take on a new shape before your very eyes, basically terraforming around you. There's lots of elevators and teleporters in sadistically hidden secrets, always inviting you to revisit a level and to go deeper than you did before. I love the variety overall. Just when you're feeling a little suffocated, you find yourself thrown into a wider area and vice versa. And just when you're tiring of combat and running out of ammo, you find yourself facing a puzzle that could involve hidden doors, timed switches, color coordination, etc. For these reasons, I find the pacing of Doom 64 to be really satisfactory and enjoyable. I'll always have a soft spot for level 6, Alpha Quadrant, because it was the first level in which I got stuck on my initial playthrough. The first level that made me realize, oh, this is more than shotgun goes boom. But don't get me wrong, there's plenty of that too. You can spend 20 minutes combing through a level, convinced you've found everything, and when you get to the end, boom, you only found 66% of the secrets. The game keeps begging you to take a closer look, and I love that. On the other hand, you have levels like level 9, even simpler. The first level of the game that takes place in Hell, and it's simply one room, one single arena, in which you encounter the Mancubus for the first time, and must eliminate waves of enemies, including Cacodemons and Hell Knights. Speaking of which, the demons. Punchatz's new and unique renditions of the classic demons featured in Doom 64 are some of my very favorites. The Cacodemon and Pain Elemental are my two favorite Doom demons, and they look sick in Doom 64. The 64 Caco actually somewhat resemble Doom Eternal's Pain Elementals. They're more brown than red, with big black horns, a yellow eye, giant claws, and a mouth full of fire. The Caco's still comical and true to form despite Doom 64's dark tone. Sometimes you can't help but laugh as he floats toward you, arms outstretched, almost smiling. But the broken shackles on his wrists really set him apart from the other renditions of the Caco and make him feel uniquely at home in Doom 64. And the Pain Elemental in Doom 64 is less of a friendly meatball and more of a horrifying abomination. Instead of one big mouth under his green eyeball, he has two fanged maws for hands, both of which launch lost souls at you, perhaps the most frustrating demons in the game. It's such a cool and unique design, and in true Doom fashion, the Elemental is a priority whenever he's on the board. You have to take care of him quickly. Doom 64 also added a new demon variant to the lineup, the Nightmare Imp, a translucent imp who's harder to see and whose purple fireballs are much faster than those fired from standard imps. Thanks to the game's new engine, there's a lot of interesting lighting tricks throughout the game as well. There's occasional fog obscuring the path ahead, there's animated skyboxes with lightning or flame effects, and there's also tight, disorienting hallways with dynamic lighting. Level 2, the Terraformer, is a great example of how Doom 64 is on a different level in this sense than Doom 1 or Doom 2. Of course, if you've ripped and teared your way through Doom 1 and 2, you'll have no trouble picking up and playing Doom 64. It's still 100% Doom at its core. It's just a different flavor of Doom. The fun, carefree days of E1M1 are over. You can't talk about Doom without talking about weapons, and Doom 64's all-new weapon designs featuring all-new sound effects are excellent. Specifically, the Doom 64 plasma gun is my favorite rendition of the weapon in any Doom game to date. Same goes for the chainsaw, which features two blades instead of one, a feature that was incorporated onto the Doom Hunter in Doom Eternal. Doom 64 also introduced the Unmaker, which was also reimagined in Doom Eternal. Doom 64's combat gameplay in general is my favorite of any classic Doom game. It's still the same basic formula, yes, but to me, Doom 64 feels slightly better than Doom 1 and Doom 2. The POV is slightly different, movement feels somewhat smoother to me, and even by modern Doom standards, Doom 64 holds up really well. A super fast pace, lots of arenas, hunting for keycards, weapon switching, the concept of there being different tools for different jobs. I recently read a mostly negative present-day review of Doom 64 in which a reviewer was complaining that the game didn't have free aiming like GoldenEye 007, which released later in 1997. And it's like, yeah, it doesn't have free aiming. That's the point. There's no time for that crap. Doom 64, like all Doom games before and after it, is about running and gunning. In my opinion, GoldenEye 007's free aiming is one of the reasons I feel like it hasn't aged as well as Doom 64. For my current tastes, GoldenEye's pace is much slower and clunkier by comparison. And again, GoldenEye will always occupy a soft spot in my heart, but whether you're measuring by 1997 standards or 2021 standards, there's a straightforward simplicity to Doom 64 that really appeals. Running down hallways, pulling your weapon's triggers. I'm big on feel in video games, and Doom 64 just feels good. Yeah, you might get stuck on some geo every once in a while because yeah, the game's 24 years old, but that's a small gripe, everything else considered. I think Hell Knights and Barons of Hell are a bit overused throughout the levels. At times, it feels like some lazy cutting and pasting, but that's really the only other criticism I could level against Doom 64, and again, it's a pretty small one. The music, lighting, and level design work in tandem to create an incredibly unique atmosphere, quite unlike anything else I've ever experienced in a game. To call it scary or creepy, those feel like understatements, because it's not jump scare scary. The unsettling nature of the game runs much deeper than that, into the realm of true horror. Even though you're the unstoppable Doom Marine, you do feel like you're a trespasser in these levels, no matter if you're navigating a UAC facility or the depths of hell. Pentagrams, inverted crosses, displays of torture. You can't help but imagine the sights and sounds of Doom 64 even make the Marine grip his shotgun just a little more tightly than usual. These days, I prefer to play Night Dive Studios' excellent 2020 port of Doom 64 on my Nintendo Switch with headphones in a dark room, and it's so immersive. Honestly, to me, it's more immersive than a lot of modern games with higher pixel counts, ray tracing, and realistic 3D models. Back to levels though. One level that's somewhat polarizing is level 23, Unholy Temple. Some people criticize its puzzles and its backtracking, but I love it. It's a multi-layered fortress with a variety of traps, puzzles, and enemy types. To me, it feels like Doom 64's final exam. It feels like Midway's way of saying, okay, you've made it this far. Now use everything you've learned from the previous 22 levels to overcome this. And the level's atmosphere is awesome, but that goes without saying. It's Doom 64. Another interesting level is level 28, the Absolution, which features the final boss battle with the Mother Demon, an evil entity that survived and resurrected all the demons the Doom Marine had previously killed, the catalyst for the game's events. This battle can feel impossible at first. You enter a single arena with a full arsenal, including a charged BFG, and must play merry-go-round, picking off waves of demons strategically using your rocket launcher and shotgun, conserving that BFG ammo until the Mother Demon finally appears, after which you run up and unload the big friendly gun on her until the job is done. And yes, this level may require several attempts, but it's literally the last traditional level in the base game, an arena full of every type of demon the game has to throw at you. If you think it's too easy, well, you are the Doom Marine. You must have been prepared for the challenge. And if you think it's too hard, you can focus on secret hunting in the previous levels to make that final battle even easier. And then the ending. After defeating the Mother Demon, the Doom Marine chooses to stay in hell. That's so heavy metal. How can you not love that? And in his recent Doom Eternal streams, current id Software creative director Hugo Martin has confirmed that yes, Doom 64 and this ending are canon. I've always loved that about the Doom lore. There's a lot of questions that remain unanswered, but that means there's a lot of room for interpretation. Now, major spoiler warning incoming for Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, so if you need to close out now, 3, 2, 1. But I feel that Doomguy's sarcophagus being found in Hell prior to the events of Doom 2016, and then Doomguy again being sealed into a sarcophagus in the sanctum above the blood swamps following the events of the Ancient Gods Part 2, this all gels so nicely with the end of Doom 64. I want to take a moment to give Hugo Martin and the current id Software team a major shout out for continuing to recognize Doom 64. Hugo is always open about growing up as a console gamer, and that Doom 64 was actually his first proper in-depth hands-on experience with a Doom game. And I feel like all the callbacks are there in the modern games. The color palettes, the renditions of Hell, the concept of bringing keys back to a hub area, like in the Doom 2016 level Necropolis, and I already mentioned the Unmaker and the Doom 64 Cacodemon design. But if you play Doom 64 before 2016 and Eternal, it makes sense. Or if you play them in reverse order, it still makes sense. That respect for the franchise's history is there. You get a real sense of where things come from. And one more shout out to Night Dive Studios for their incredible port, which is basically available on all platforms today. Night Dive added so many little embellishments to Doom 64 while entirely preserving the original experience that, in my opinion, makes this port the definitive version of the game. A stable 60 frames per second alone makes this port very, very, very worth its measly $4.99 price tag. Seriously, if you're a Doom fan, there's no reason you shouldn't have Doom 64 on at least one of your platforms. I mean, come on, this game's the price of a small latte. But these guys at Night Dive, they seriously know what they're doing with 90s era shooters. And they, along with id and Bethesda, even added a few new Doom Eternal tie-in levels to Doom 64 prior to the port's 2020 release. How cool is that? How many other developers would dish out that level of fan service? I talk a lot on my channel about remakes, remasters, and the topic of video game preservation. And with so many unfortunate examples out there, so many neglected franchises, and so many games that have been somewhat lost to time, id and Bethesda do deserve credit for making their entire library of games so widely available on a variety of platforms. The fact that you can play every Doom game ever officially released going back 28 years on a Nintendo Switch is nothing short of outstanding. It really warmed my heart to see this port celebrated in the form of special collector's editions and such. I think this game came out at a time when there was a little bit of Doom fatigue. Not that I agree, but that's how some people felt, especially silly game journalists who were silly even in the 90s. And obviously, a lot of other big-name first-person shooter games were hitting the market, ironically thanks to the original Doom games. But add in the fact that Doom 64 was not developed by id, and I think for some, this game was written off or overlooked, but I'm glad that it feels like in recent years, Doom 64 has gotten the love and respect it deserves. This video here is simply my way of doing my part to give this game its flowers. It's undeniably one of my all-time favorites, especially when it comes to the FPS genre. And look, I'm the first to get nervous and curmudgeonly when a new team takes control of an existing IP I love with minimal, if any, input from the original creators. I feel like there's a lot of cash-grabby games, movies, and TV shows out there these days, these endlessly and generically expanding universes that just don't resonate with me whatsoever. But Doom 64 is a clear example and exception to the rule of how it can work. A game that was faithful to the original formula that made its predecessors successful, but with careful innovations and deviations that made it stand on its own. I think it was a case of right place, right people, right time. I think the Doom franchise needed a little fresh inspiration after Doom 1 and Doom 2, and Midway, in my opinion, did a stellar job of creating a unique Doom game with all kinds of brilliant touches. and that picture-perfect ending, whose ripple effect is still felt in modern Doom games. In conclusion, some games age beautifully, others less so. When I play Super Mario Bros. 3 today, it's as good as when I first played it as a kid, as visually attractive and cleverly designed as it was 30 years ago, a game that developers today still aspire to. But when I play GoldenEye 007, for example, like I said earlier, I feel like that's an example of a game that's better left in the past, in my rose-colored memory bank. I'll always love that game for what it is and all the fun it offered me and my friends back in the day, but it does feel slow and stuttery and clunky by today's standards. Conversely, I don't at all need to put on my nostalgia goggles when I fire up Doom 64. The movement, the level design, the art direction, it all coalesces into an amazing experience that, pixel charm and all, puts a lot of modern day games to shame. My enjoyment of Doom 64 was delayed, sure, but I'm still thankful for that day in the video rental store more than 2 decades ago now. The day I spotted the Mother Demon for the first time, and the day that Doom itself officially landed on my radar. So that's all from me. Now head down to the comments because I'd love to hear your thoughts about Doom 64. Have you played it? Have you played the latest Night Dive port? Do you share my feelings about the game? Do you appreciate the fact that the game has officially entered the modern Doom canon? As always, thanks so much for watching, and remember that you can find me on Twitter at terapop tweets, on Instagram at terapopgram, on Discord at Terapop's Treehouse, and on Patreon at patreon.com/terapop, where I offer all kinds of cool tiers and perks for my patrons. Of course, only contribute if you're able to do so, but this is a great way to support what I do and to ensure more future content like this video right here. So that's all for now. Thank you again, and I'll catch you next time.